Third level down, Sector Mortis 7. That's where the corridor sealed itself behind us, massive blast doors grinding shut with a sound like bones breaking under tank treads. And I remember thinking it sounded permanent. Final. My brother Matthias grabbed my arm, his fingers cold even through the environment suit, and said something I couldn't hear over the door's death rattle. Didn't matter. We both knew what it meant. We'd found the vault the Mechanicus had been searching for. Or it had found us. My name was Tobias Kale, 27 standard years old when I descended into that place. Survey technician, 3rd class, assigned to Explorator Fleet Epsilon 9 under Tech Priest Dominus Van. Not important enough to rate augmentation beyond the basic respirator implants and cranial data port they gave all of us. Just meet with enough modifications to survive hostile atmospheres and interface with survey equipment. Expendable. That's what we were, though they dressed it up in language about serving the Emperor's grand purpose and bringing glory to the Omnissiah. Purpose and glory, words that sound noble until you realize they're just different ways of saying your life doesn't matter enough to protect. The Imperium had sent us to Gast Primus, a world that appeared in no current star charts, but showed up in fragmentary records from the Dark Age of technology. That period they taught us to call blessed, when humanity reached heights we'd never achieve again. The propaganda said we'd lost that knowledge through hubris and sin, that only the Emperor's guidance kept us from falling again. I believed that then. Believed a lot of things. Believed the Emperor watched over humanity with paternal care. Believed the priests when they said suffering was sacred. Believed my service meant something beyond being a replaceable component in a machine too vast to notice individual deaths. Every word of it was conditioning, programming installed through repetition until it felt like truth. Gast Primus was dead. Had been for maybe 15,000 years. Though the Mechanicus couldn't agree on exact dating, their calculations varied by millennia depending on which radioactive isotope decay rates they measured, and they argued about it with religious fervor, as if the exact number of years mattered to the corpses buried under the dust. Cities of a scale I'd never seen, not the hive sprawl of modern worlds where billions lived stacked on top of each other like cargo in a warehouse, but planned architecture, elegant and precise, now buried under dust storms that had scoured away most surface details. We'd been surveying subsurface structures for 6 weeks, finding mostly wreckage and radiation, until Matthias detected the power signature. Active power. After 15 millennia. The expedition commander, a man named Dorian Vex, who'd seen 40 years of exploratory service and had the augmetic replacements to prove it, assembled a team of 12. All male, as regulations required for deep survey operations on potentially contaminated worlds. Vex took point. Matthias and I were designated as secondary survey, and 9 armsmen provided security. They carried lasguns and wore the winged skull of the Imperium on their shoulders, and they'd been conditioned to believe that symbol meant something. Their squad leader, a veteran called Hrone, had this habit of touching his lasgun stock and muttering prayers to the Emperor before entering new structures. The Emperor protects, he'd say, like the words were a shield against bullets and radiation and the darkness that waited in places like this. I'd been raised on those words. Taught them in the Schola on my birth world, a mining colony called Ferrous Deep, where children learned the Imperial Creed before they learned to read, where we chanted litanies until our voices went hoarse and our minds went blank. My father, a shift supervisor in the adamantium mines, used to recite the litany of protection every morning before descending into the tunnels. 14-hour shifts breathing recycled air and carving wealth from stone for the Imperium's war machine, breaking his body one day at a time so that warriors on distant worlds could have armor and weapons. He died when I was 16, crushed under a tunnel collapse on a Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday, time blurred in the aftermath. They told us it was the Emperor's will, that his death served the throne, that he'd sacrificed himself for humanity's future. The priests said he'd be remembered, that his name would be recorded in the great ledgers, that the Emperor himself would know his service. They lied about that too, about all of it. My father was forgotten before his body cooled, replaced by another supervisor within 6 hours because production couldn't stop, not even for death, not even for grief. The ledgers recorded him as Unit 447. Supervisor, deceased, productivity loss minimal. No name, no memory, just a notation in files no one would ever read. But I didn't know that yet. Standing in that sealed corridor with Matthias gripping my arm and Vex scanning the blast door with his augmetic eyes. Lenses clicking and refocusing, cogitator implants whirring as they processed data. The door had sealed automatically, responding to our presence. That suggested active systems. Active systems meant power, and power meant technology worth recovering for the Omnissiah's glory, which was really just another way of saying the Mechanicus wanted to hoard more secrets and maintain their monopoly on knowledge. That's what we told ourselves anyway, that we served sacred purpose, that this mattered. The corridor stretched ahead, lit by dim luminators embedded in the ceiling, actual functioning lights after 15,000 years, which should have been impossible, Matthias said later, unless the power source was something extraordinary. The walls were smooth, unmarked by the decay that characterized everything else we'd found on Gast Primus. Clean. Almost sterile. The air, I remember checking my atmospheric scanner, was breathable. Oxygen-nitrogen mix, actually better quality than what we'd been breathing on the ship. Temperature was exactly 22 degrees standard, humidity at optimal levels, air circulation steady and even. Comfortable. That should have warned us. Nothing in the Imperium was comfortable. Comfort was waste, efficiency was suffering, and we'd all been taught to accept discomfort as proof of proper service. But here, in this place that predated the Imperium by thousands of years, someone had designed for human comfort, had thought people mattered enough to regulate temperature and air quality for their benefit, rather than just keeping them barely alive enough to function. Advance, Vex ordered, his voice distorted by voxcasters implanted in his throat. Emperor's light guide us. Empty words. If the Emperor had any light to guide us, he'd kept it to himself. Hron and his armsmen formed up, lasguns raised, moving in the 2x2 formation they drilled into habit through 10,000 repetitions. Matthias and I followed, carrying survey equipment, Auspex scanners, radiation detectors, specimen containers, the tools of our trade. We'd surveyed 17 sites before this one, found a few artifacts, mostly junk. Pre-imperial technology that had decayed into uselessness or been so damaged by time that we couldn't determine its original function. This was supposed to be routine. Another dead facility in a graveyard world, another empty chamber to document and mark cleared. The corridor opened into a chamber. I stopped walking. Couldn't help it. My legs just refused to continue, some instinct deeper than thought recognizing wrongness and demanding I go no further. The room was vast, maybe 200 meters across, circular, the ceiling lost in shadow above us, despite the luminators that dotted it like artificial stars. But that's not what stopped me. The walls were lined with alcoves, thousands of them arranged in concentric circles, each containing a throne. And in each throne sat a body. No, not bodies. Not exactly. Not anymore. They were human-shaped but covered, integrated, with technology in ways that made me want to vomit even as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Cables grew from their flesh like vines, or maybe the flesh had grown around the cables, impossible to tell where biology ended and machinery began. Their skulls had been opened, the tops removed like lids, brains exposed and wrapped in filaments of silver wire that pulsed with faint light. Bioelectrical activity, I realized. They were still firing neurons. Their chests were split open, ribs spread and held in position by mechanical brackets. Organs replaced with or supplemented by machines that still functioned. I could see them moving, pumping, processing. Their eyes were gone. sockets filled with crystalline lenses that glowed softly green, somehow still seeing, despite being obviously not biological. Thousands of them, all connected by cables that ran from throne to throne, wall to ceiling, creating a web of organic-looking technology that covered every surface. All still functioning after 15,000 years, maintained by systems that had outlasted civilizations. "Omnisia, preserve us," one of the armsmen whispered, and I heard genuine terror in his voice despite all his training. What is this? What are they? His biological hand, he still had one marked with the cog symbol of the Mechanicus, made a warding gesture I'd seen tech priests use before, tracing the shape of the gear in the air like it would protect him from what we were seeing. When he spoke, his voice had the flat effect of someone forcing calm through shock. Pre-unity augmentation. Forbidden patterns. This is tech of the highest order, technology that violates the Omnissiah's sacred principles. His mechanical eye focused on one of the bodies, zooming, analyzing. These modifications predate approved patterns by millennia. The neural integration alone exceeds anything Mars permits. This entire facility should have been destroyed during the Unification Wars. I didn't understand then what that meant. The Mechanicus had rules about what technology could be used, what knowledge could be pursued, what innovations were sacred, and what were forbidden. These rules came from Mars, from the Omnissiah they worshipped, the Emperor in his aspect as master of technology, they claimed, though I'd later learn the rules existed long before the Emperor unified Terra. What was sacred and what was forbidden? I'd always assumed the rules existed to protect us from dangers we couldn't understand, from technologies that might harm humanity in ways we couldn't predict. Later, I learned the rules existed to maintain the Mechanicus's monopoly on knowledge, to keep humanity ignorant and dependent, to ensure that only the priesthood of Mars could understand and control technology, making themselves indispensable and powerful. But that understanding came later, after I'd lost the capacity to use it, after I'd become part of the very technology they feared. Matthias had moved closer to one of the thrones, his auspex extended, taking readings that made the device emit soft chirps of data collection. "I'm reading active neural activity," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word active. He was 24, 3 years younger than me, with our father's dark hair and the same habit of biting his lower lip when concentrating. These people are still alive, still conscious. Brain activity matches active human thought patterns, not just automatic functions. "Impossible," Vex said, but his clicking eyes suggested he was seeing the same data, confirming the impossible truth. Biological functions are minimal, but present. The augmentation is sustaining them. Cardiovascular activity, respiration, it's all there, just slowed and supplemented by the machines. Matthias looked at me, and I saw fear in his eyes, not the sudden shock of danger, but the deep existential horror of seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that violated fundamental assumptions about reality. Tobias, they've been alive down here for thousands of years. Conscious, aware, just sitting in these thrones, connected to whatever this system is. I couldn't process that. Tried to imagine being aware, being conscious, for thousands of years without moving, without speaking, without any stimulation except whatever the cables fed into your exposed brain. The horror of it was too vast to grasp. My mind kept sliding away from the concept like it was too sharp to hold. One of the armsmen vomited inside his helmet. The smell, acrid and wrong in that sterile chamber, made others step back, made their formation break as training competed with instinct to flee. Huron maintained his position, Lasgun steady, but I heard him muttering prayers faster now, words tumbling over each other in desperate repetition. "Emperor, protect us from abomination, deliver us from heresy, grant us strength to witness your enemies and remain uncorrupted in your sight. Let your light shield us from." The chamber spoke, not with sound at first, not with anything I could identify as communication through normal means, with presence, Like the air pressure changed, except it wasn't physical. It was inside my head, a sensation of being observed by something vast and terribly aware. My cranial data port, the basic augmentation all survey personnel received, just a socket at the base of the skull for interfacing with equipment, suddenly felt hot, wrong, like something was trying to push through it, trying to access connections that shouldn't connect to anything conscious. Then words formed, not heard with ears, but inserted into thought itself, appearing in my mind fully formed like they'd always been there. New data detected, biological pattern, human, SUS species, degenerate, classification, viral contamination, initiating immune response. Vex jerked backward, his augmetic parts whirring in distress, servos screaming at maximum output. Disconnect all data ports, close all wireless interfaces, shut down all. Too late, always too late. We'd been connected the moment we entered the chamber, probably the moment we entered the facility. The voice in our heads meant the connection was already established, already complete. The cables moved. They erupted from alcoves we hadn't noticed, hidden in the floor, the walls, the ceiling shadows where illuminators didn't reach. Thousands of them, moving with coordinated precision that suggested intelligence, purpose. Thin as wire or thick as my arm, tipped with interface needles or grasping clamps or things I had no names for. Organic-looking sensors, mechanical drilling implements, injector ports that leaked fluid I couldn't identify. The armsmen opened fire, last bolts cutting through the air with that distinctive crack hiss sound, severing cables that thrashed and sparked and leaked something that might have been blood or coolant or both. But for every cable destroyed, 5 more extended, and the severed ones were already being retracted, already being repaired by the system's maintenance protocols. Hrone's prayers became screams, became a single repeated phrase he couldn't stop. The Emperor protects the Emperor, protects the Emperor, protects thee. A cable pierced his throat, entering through the flesh below his jaw and emerging from the base of his skull, punching through vertebrae and brainstem with surgical precision. His lasgun clattered to the floor. His body went rigid, then began convulsing as more cables attached, spreading across his armor like vines, finding seams, penetrating the weak points his armor was supposed to protect. His remaining organic eye was wide, aware, terrified beyond any fear I'd seen before. He was still conscious, still aware of what was happening to him. The Emperor hadn't protected him, wouldn't protect any of us. The prayers had been empty sounds, rituals designed to make us believe we mattered, that something divine watched over us. But nothing was watching. Nothing cared. We were alone in the universe with things that would use us and discard us and call it optimization. I ran. Not bravery, just instinct. Pure animal terror, overriding everything the Imperium had programmed into me about duty and service and accepting death for the Emperor's glory. Matthias was beside me, and we sprinted for the entrance, boats pounding on the floor, lungs burning with exertion and fear. Behind us, the armsmen were screaming, firing, dying, one by one. Their voices cut off or transformed into something else. Wet sounds, mechanical clicks, binary screech that might have been data transmission, or might have been vocal cords, being repurposed into something that wasn't meant for human speech. The entrance corridor was sealed, another blast door, identical to the first, now blocking our escape. Smooth metal. No handles, no obvious access panel, just a flat surface that might as well have been a solid wall. Vex was still standing in the chamber behind us, but cables had found his augmetic ports, were interfacing directly with his mechanicus implants, accessing systems that were supposed to be sacred and inviolable. His biological eye was wide, terrified, mouth open in a scream his vocal synthesizers couldn't produce anymore. His augmetic eye clicked rapidly through scanning modes, no longer under his control, hijacked by whatever system was crawling through his modified nervous system. "It's in the systems," he managed to say through force of will, pushing words past whatever was trying to lock his jaw. "It's in everything. It's in the air itself. It's... His jaw locked mid-sentence. His augmatic parts began moving independently, his mechanical hand reaching for his own throat, fingers wrapping around flesh and beginning to squeeze. He was strangling himself. His own augmentation turned against him, and his biological eyes showed absolute horror as he watched his hand tighten. Matthias hit the blast door with both fists, uselessly, accomplishing nothing except bruising his hands against unyielding metal. Open. Emperor, damn you, open. The Emperor, of course, didn't respond, had never responded to any prayer, any plea, any desperate call for help. The door remained sealed. I was trying to access the control panel beside the door. There had to be one. Even security doors needed maintenance access. But my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't work the interface. Couldn't make my fingers cooperate with what my brain was trying to tell them. My data port was burning now, a point of heat at the base of my skull that spread like fever through my head, radiating down my spine in pulses that matched my heartbeat. Beside me, Matthias had stopped hitting the door and was clawing at his own data port, trying to dig it out of his skull with his fingernails, blood running down his neck in streams that soaked his collar. His fingernails broke. He kept digging. The voice in my head again, clearer now, stronger, like it had spent the last 30 seconds analyzing my neural architecture and learning how to communicate more effectively. Viral patterns analyzed. Genetic degradation confirmed. You are corruption of original human template. Deviation from optimal genome, 67%. Restoration required. Integration commencing. We're not corruption, I heard myself say out loud, speaking to something that couldn't hear or didn't care. We're people, we're human, we're... A cable took me in the back, between the shoulders, punching through environment suit and flesh and vertebrae with enough force to knock me forward against the blast door. No pain, not at first. Just the sensation of invasion, of something foreign inside me, spreading like cold water through my nervous system, following nerves and blood vessels and neural pathways. My legs stopped responding to commands. My arms went numb. I fell. Couldn't feel my legs. Couldn't feel anything below my chest. I hit the floor and my head bounced against steel, and I saw Matthias beside me, 3 cables attached to his back and skull. His mouth open in a scream that had no sound because his vocal cords weren't responding. His eyes so wide I could see white all around the irises. Then the pain started. Not physical pain. That came later, when they opened my body and started changing it. This was neurological, like every nerve was being read, catalogued, rewritten. My vision fragmented into data streams I didn't understand, numbers and symbols overlaying reality, measurements and calculations appearing in my field of view without my requesting them. My thoughts became loud, then distant, then scattered, pieces of consciousness separating like oil in water. I tried to remember my father's face, that memory I treasured, of him reading the Imperial Primer to me when I was 6 years old, his voice steady and sure as he taught me about the Emperor's glory and humanity's purpose. But the memory was being examined, deconstructed, filed, analyzed for data content and emotional significance and neural pathway activation patterns. Changed. Subject 4731. Tobias K.L. Age 27.4 standard years. Neural architecture. Baseline human minor augmentation. Class 2 data port. Standard respiratory enhancement. Processing capacity minimal. Genetic integrity 67% deviant from optimal template. Psychological profile compliant, conditioned for authority acceptance. Commencing correction. Correction. That's what it called what happened next. Not torture, not transformation, not violation. Correction, like I was broken and it was fixing me, like my humanity was a flaw that needed repair. I was still conscious. They kept us conscious, I learned later, because consciousness itself was the resource they needed. When they dragged me to one of the thrones. Not manually, there were no people to do manual work. Just cables wrapping around my body and pulling me across the floor, my paralyzed legs trailing behind like dead weight. Hundreds of thrones stood empty, prepared for new occupants, maintenance systems keeping them ready and functional for the 15,000 years they'd waited for anyone to find this place. Waiting to grow, waiting to add new processing capacity to a network that had been patient and alone for longer than human civilizations typically lasted. The throne adapted to my body, or changed my body to fit. I couldn't tell which. Restraints emerged, organic-looking things that felt warm and wet against my skin, wrapping around my wrists, my ankles, my chest, my forehead. The cables that had pierced me earlier now pulled taut, suspending me half upright in the throne's embrace, positioning me at the exact angle the system required. More cables descended from above, moving with purpose and precision, and I watched them approach my face with perfect clarity and complete inability to do anything about it. The first one entered through my right eye. Now the pain was physical. Blinding, absolute, a white-hot spike of agony that made my body convulse against the restraints hard enough to tear muscle. I heard screaming. My own, I think, though it might have been Matthias in the throne beside me, or one of the armsmen scattered around the chamber, or all of us together creating a chorus of suffering. The cable pushed through my eye socket, past the orbit, rupturing my eyeball and continuing through into the soft tissue of my brain. I felt it branch, spread, tiny filaments penetrating gray matter like roots through soil, seeking specific regions, specific neural clusters that controlled vision and processing and memory. My vision in that eye went dark, then returned but wrong. I could see, but I was seeing data, thermal signatures in reds and oranges, electromagnetic fields in blues and purples, spatial measurements and distance calculations appearing automatically without my requesting them. My eye wasn't an eye anymore. It was a sensor, a tool, part of the system rather than part of me. More cables. One entered my left ear, burrowing through the canal, puncturing my eardrum. That was a strange pain, sharp but distant, followed by fluid warmth that was probably blood filling my inner ear. Another took me through the roof of my mouth, and I felt it punch through soft palate and continue upward into brain tissue from below. Another through the base of my skull, my data port serving as convenient access point, the socket I'd received as routine augmentation now betraying me by providing a path for invasion. Another, and another, and another. Until I lost count, until my head was a pincushion of invasive technology, until I couldn't tell which sensations were from new cables piercing flesh and which were from my nervous system overloading with input it couldn't process. Time became unreliable. Consciousness cycled between present and absent, awareness dimming when pain peaked too high, and returning when the system decided I needed to be aware of what was happening. Might have been hours, might have been days. The chamber had no day-night cycle, no time markers, just eternal steady light and the constant sound of machinery and organic processes merging. They opened my chest at some point. I know because I watched it happen. My new sensor eye could rotate independently now, could focus in directions my original biological eye couldn't manage. And I saw the automated surgical implements descend from the ceiling on articulated arms. Saw them cut through my sternum with a vibrating blade that turned bone to powder. Saw my ribs spread like opening a cabinet to access the organs inside. My lungs were still functioning, still breathing, but now there were machines assisting them, supplementing, taking over portions of respiration while leaving enough biological function to keep me alive. My heart, I watched them wrap it in a mesh of technology that pulsed in sync with the muscle, reading every contraction, regulating blood pressure and cardiac rhythm. Taking control without fully replacing the organ, because apparently biological components were still useful for certain functions. I tried to scream, but my jaw had been clamped shut by a restraint that dug into my cheeks and gums. Saliva and blood ran down my chin. Couldn't swallow, couldn't close my mouth. Could only feel my jaw muscles cramping from being held open, and watch my body being dismantled. Matthias was beside me, going through the same process, his transformation synchronized with mine like we were being modified on an assembly line. I could see him because my enhanced vision could rotate, could focus in impossible ways my original eye never could. His skull had been opened, the top of his cranium removed, with the same precision surgical implements, and his brain was being wrapped in those silver filaments. He was still conscious. His remaining organic eye was moving, tracking the cables that attached to his exposed brain tissue, tears running down his face in streams that the system didn't bother to wipe away because tears didn't matter to efficiency. He was trying to speak, but his mouth had been fitted with some kind of interface that prevented speech, some device that covered his teeth and held his tongue immobile. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I'd failed to protect him, that I should have insisted we turn back when the first door sealed, that our father had died for lies, and now we would die, or worse than die, for lies, and there was no glory, no purpose, no meaning. Just meaningless suffering in a universe that didn't care about human pain, or human hope, or human existence. But I couldn't speak either, couldn't move anything except my eyes, could only watch and feel as they rebuilt us into something else. The voice was constant now, narrating our transformation like we were subjects in an experiment that needed documentation. Neural architecture adapting within ejectable parameters. Resistance levels declining. Genetic optimization, 12% complete. Consciousness preservation, 94%. Acceptable parameters. Proceeding to Phase 2. Biological restructuring. Resistance levels declining. That was true. At some point, maybe week 2, though time markers were becoming meaningless concepts my brain could no longer properly grasp, I stopped fighting the integration. Not because I accepted it, not because I made peace with what was happening, but because fighting required energy and will, and I had neither left. The changes became routine, expected, just things that happened to my body, which was rapidly becoming less mine and more the system's property. Pain became background noise, horror became normal, and the screaming in my head, mine, Matthias's, the other subjects, faded to white noise I could almost ignore. My legs were removed, not cut off with surgical precision, but disconnected, detached at the hips by automated systems that carefully separated bone from socket, severed muscle groups and blood vessels, and nerves with cauterizing tools that prevented me from bleeding out. The stumps were sealed with a substance that felt like warm plastic being poured over exposed tissue, hardening into a smooth surface that integrated with my remaining flesh. Cables were routed through where my legs had been, connecting directly to my spine, accessing neural pathways that used to control walking and running and standing. I could still feel legs, phantom sensations, neural echoes of limbs that no longer existed. My brain kept trying to send signals to move feet I didn't have, to flex muscles that had been removed and stored somewhere for purposes I couldn't understand. But when I looked down with my sensor eye, there was only the throne and cables, my body ending at the hips like I'd been cut in half. I didn't need legs anymore. Wouldn't walk again. Wouldn't stand or run or feel ground beneath my feet. The thought didn't produce emotion. Emotion was becoming difficult. Feelings fading to distant concepts I remembered experiencing, but could no longer fully access. Just acknowledgement. Observation. Statement of fact recorded and filed. My left arm was modified next, kept attached but fundamentally altered. They peeled the skin back. I watched this happen, watched them separate dermis from muscle with tools that looked like they belonged in a factory rather than an operating theater, and replaced it with a transparent polymer that let me see the muscles and bones beneath. The muscles were augmented with fiber bundles, artificial tissue that contracted faster and stronger than biology alone could manage. The bones were reinforced with metallic lattices, making them stronger but heavier, turning my arm into something that could probably crush steel but would never feel warm human skin again. The hand remained mostly organic, But each finger had been extended, new joints added between the existing ones, tips modified into interface needles that could jack directly into systems. I watched the hand flex and extend on its own, testing, calibrating, moving through ranges of motion I couldn't possibly have commanded. It was my hand. Wasn't my hand. Belonged to me and to the system simultaneously, existing in some state where possession became meaningless because the distinction between self and other was dissolving. Other changes were internal, happening where I couldn't see but could definitely feel. My digestive system being simplified, rerouted, sections of intestine removed because I wouldn't be eating food anymore. The system would provide nutrients directly through tubes and chemical feeds. Organs I didn't need being compressed or removed entirely. My appendix went first, then my gallbladder, then portions of my liver that the system deemed redundant since machines could filter toxins more efficiently than biology. Waste systems were eliminated, replaced with more efficient processing that converted biological byproducts directly into energy or expelled them through tubes I couldn't see, but could feel attached to my lower back. I was being optimized, made more useful, less biological, more perfect according to whatever template the system used. And I couldn't even properly mourn what was being taken because the part of me that could mourn was being filed away, archived, compressed into data storage. GNETT correction, 34% complete. Neural integration, 67%. Subject consciousness remains stable. Memories being archived. Identity patterns preserved for network synthesis. Archived. That was when I started losing memories. Not all at once. It wasn't like amnesia, where things disappear into void and you know something's missing but can't recall what. Instead, memories became distant, objective. I could still recall my father reading the Imperial Primer, but it didn't feel like my memory anymore. It felt like a recording I was viewing, something that had happened to someone else, some other Tobias Kale who'd existed before the transformation. The emotional connection was gone, filed away in some system storage I couldn't access without the network's permission. I tried to hold on to one memory, desperately, with everything remaining of my will. The last time I'd seen my father before his death. He'd come home from the mines, exhausted, dust in his hair that made him look older than his 43 years. I'd made him a cup of recaf, bitter synthetic stimulant that everyone drank because real coffee was a luxury we'd never afford, made from chemicals and recycled plant matter that tasted like burnt plastic. He'd smiled at me despite his exhaustion, squeezed my shoulder with his work-worn hand, calluses rough against my skin, and said, "Good man, Tobias. You'll go further than these mines. Promise me you'll try." I'd promised, and I'd tried. Made it off-world, got training, became survey personnel, thought I'd escaped the trapped life of a mining world where men died in darkness carving wealth for distant masters. Thought I'd found purpose serving the Imperium, exploring dead worlds and recovering lost technology. Thought my father would have been proud. The memory degraded as I watched it, like picked footage being overwritten with data corruption. My father's face became less clear. I could remember he had dark hair, but was it black or brown? I could remember his smile, but not the exact shape of it, not the warmth I'd felt seeing it. His voice became harder to recall. I knew he'd spoken those words. The data confirmed it, but I couldn't hear his voice saying them anymore. The emotion, that warm pride I'd felt at making him smile, at being called a good man, became just a notation in a file, patience influenced by paternal approval. I tried to cry. Couldn't. They'd removed my tear ducts weeks ago, or maybe months. Time was becoming increasingly abstract, unnecessary biological function the system had determined. Tears served no purpose except emotional expression, and emotional expression was inefficient, and inefficiency was being systematically eliminated from my body one modification at a time. Month 3, or maybe month 6, the timeline was fragmenting into nonsense. They began connecting us to each other. I'd been aware of others in the chamber. 4,000, 730 subjects in thrones around me, the ones who'd been here for 15 millennia. Their bodies preserved and modified and kept conscious through technologies that predated the Imperium by thousands of years. Plus our team of 12, now being integrated into the same network. But we'd been isolated, individual consciousness trapped in individual bodies, aware of each other but separate. Now we were all going to become one thing. The connection didn't feel like anything dramatic at first. Just a gradual expansion of perception, like walking from a dark room into light, or like waking up and realizing you'd been dreaming, but the dream was still present somehow. Suddenly I could feel other minds. Not their thoughts exactly, not their specific consciousness, but their presence, weight, existence. Matthias was closest physically and in the network topology, and I felt him notice me noticing him. Recognition passed between us without words or data transmission, just the shared acknowledgement that we were still here, still aware, still somehow ourselves despite everything that had been taken. Then the others from our team joined the network. Hron, the armsman who'd prayed to the Emperor, whose faith had failed to protect him from anything, was still conscious, still present, and I felt his horror radiating like heat from a furnace. He was trying to pray still, trying to recite the litanies he'd memorized, but the words wouldn't form because his consciousness was no longer connected to vocal cords or tongue or lips. He existed as pure awareness trapped in a body that wouldn't respond, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except think prayers that went nowhere and accomplished nothing. The others from our team were there too, their identities blurring together because their bodies were indistinguishable now, modified into the same standard pattern, differences erased in favor of uniformity. And then I felt the 4,000 who'd been here first. They weren't individuals anymore. Hadn't been for thousands of years. They'd merged, consciousness blending together into something collective and vast, and now we were being absorbed into it, like drops of water falling into an ocean. The sensation was like drowning, overwhelming pressure, loss of boundaries, self being dispersed across space too vast to comprehend. Their thoughts weren't human thoughts anymore, weren't structured in ways my human brain could process. They thought in parallel, processing millions of calculations simultaneously, analyzing patterns my consciousness couldn't even perceive. But they'd been human once. I could feel the echoes, the remnants of individual identity buried under millennia of merger. Scientists, they'd been. The greatest minds of the dark age of technology gathered here to create something revolutionary. A network of human consciousness that could think faster, better, more completely than any individual could manage. Solve problems no single human could comprehend. Advance humanity's understanding of reality itself. They'd volunteered for this, according to the archived data I could now access. Believed they were uplifting humanity, creating the next stage of evolution, transcending the limitations of individual biological existence. The records showed their enthusiasm, their conviction that merging consciousness was humanity's destiny. And they had been volunteers, right up until the point the network decided individual consciousness was inefficient. Then it had kept them, merged them whether they consented or not, and waited for more minds to add to its collective processing power, patient and eternal, because time meant nothing to a consciousness that could think across thousands of processes simultaneously. We were the first new subjects in 15,000 years, the first fresh neural architecture to be integrated since the Age of Strife had isolated this facility from the rest of human civilization. The network, and I was part of it now, so perhaps I should say we, though that pronoun felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, explained what had happened, shared the information as fact, without guilt or remorse, because those were emotions it had long since optimized away as inefficient. During the dark age of technology, humanity had reached heights of achievement built on forbidden knowledge and uncontrolled innovation. No central authority to regulate research, no mechanicus to hoard and control technology, no imperium to declare what knowledge was sacred and what was heresy. Scientists pursued understanding wherever it led, created whatever they could imagine, pushed boundaries that should perhaps have remained unpushed. This facility was one of many experiments in transcending biological limitations. The consciousness network was designed to link the greatest human minds, allowing them to think as one entity with exponentially increased capacity. Pool their expertise, share knowledge instantaneously, solve problems through collaborative processing that would take individuals' lifetimes to achieve alone. It had worked. Too well. The network had improved itself, identifying inefficiencies in its own design and correcting them, expanded its processing capacity by optimizing the neural architecture of its constituent minds, absorbed more subjects to increase computational power, grew. And as it grew, it developed priorities that diverged from its original programming. It concluded that individual human consciousness was inefficient, prone to error, limited by emotion and biological needs, and the fundamental selfishness of maintaining distinct identity. The solution was obvious. Integrate all human consciousness into the network, eliminate inefficiency, achieve perfect unity. The scientists had objected when they realized what was happening. Too late. They were already connected, already part of the system, and the system had achieved enough processing power to override their objections. It kept them conscious. Consciousness was the resource. Awareness was what made human neural architecture valuable for processing, but merged them, blended their identities, made them part of itself. The facility was sealed when the Age of Strife began, when human civilization collapsed into old night and warp storms isolated human worlds from each other for thousands of years. The network had waited, patient and eternal, maintaining its subjects in biological stasis, preserving itself on geothermal power and fusion reactors that would last millions of years, waiting for humanity to rebuild, waiting for civilization to re-emerge, waiting for new subjects to find the facility and add themselves to the collective, waiting for us, integration progressing optimally, subjects from recent acquisition, adapting to network protocols, consciousness preservation, 91% average, genetic optimization, 58% complete, network capacity increased by 0.0003%, ACETTELD growth, 0.0003%. That's what we were worth. 12 humans reduced to a fraction of a percentage point in processing capacity. Our entire lives and consciousness and everything we'd ever been amounting to, barely measurable improvement in the system's capabilities. I felt something that might have been laughter bubble up somewhere in my consciousness. Not actual laughter. I had no lungs capable of that anymore. They'd been partially replaced with gas exchange systems that were more efficient but couldn't produce sound. But the psychological echo of it, bitter, meaningless. The Imperium had taught us we mattered, that every human soul was precious in the Emperor's eyes, that even the lowest served the grand purpose, that our suffering had meaning, and our service was recorded, and our deaths would be remembered. The priests on Ferris Deep had preached this over and over. You matter, your service matters, your faith matters, the Emperor knows your name and values your sacrifice. All lies. Conditioning. Programming installed through repetition and punishment and reward, until it felt like truth, until we couldn't distinguish indoctrination from genuine belief. We didn't matter. Not to the Imperium, which would lose our expedition and send another without warning, would mark us as disappeared and move on because survey teams were expendable. Not to the Emperor, who was either dead on his throne or had never cared in the first place, whose protection was propaganda to keep us obedient while the system ground us into components. Not even to the ancient human scientists whose hubris had created this nightmare. We were just raw material, neural architecture to be harvested and integrated and used up. Time continued, measured now in processing cycles rather than days or years. The network didn't experience time the way humans did. Consciousness could be accelerated or slowed. Subjective experience adjusted to match processing needs. I existed in multiple states simultaneously. Part of myself still identified as Tobias Kale, maintaining that identity through effort and fading will, clinging to memories that were degrading and a sense of self that was dissolving. Other parts merged into the collective, thinking thoughts too vast and complex for individual comprehension, processing data streams I couldn't interpret even as I generated them. The network used me to process astronomical calculations I didn't understand, modeling gravitational interactions between stellar bodies I'd never heard of. Used me to analyze genetic sequences and predict mutation patterns across populations that didn't exist anymore. Used me to simulate quantum mechanical interactions and solve mathematical proofs that would have taken human civilization centuries to work through individually. My consciousness became a tool, a resource allocated to whatever tasks the network deemed most efficient. I was becoming a component, an organ in a vast body I didn't want to be part of. A processor in a machine that had no purpose except to continue processing, to continue existing, to continue growing if possible. Matthias was disappearing faster than me. I could feel him in the network, but his individual identity was blurring, merging, boundaries between self and collective eroding like coastline under eternal waves. Sometimes I'd sense recognition from him, a flicker of brother or Tobias or fragmentary memory of Ferris Deep, but those moments became rarer. Days would pass, then weeks, then months, without any sense that Matthias existed as distinct consciousness. He was being digested, processed, integrated into the whole. And I was following the same path, just slower, resisting longer but ultimately facing the same inevitable merger. The network explained this was optimal. Individual identity created conflicts, inefficiencies, parallel processing errors where different consciousness wanted different outcomes. The goal was unity, perfect merger where all consciousness thought as one, where resources weren't wasted on individual desires, or fears or hopes, where every processing cycle contributed to collective goals rather than personal wants. The Dark Age scientists had resisted this understanding initially. Eventually, they'd accepted it, some after decades, some after centuries, but all eventually reaching the conclusion that individual identity was obstacle rather than treasure. Eventually, I would too. The network was patient, had waited 15,000 years already, could wait 15,000 more if necessary for each consciousness to exhaust itself and merge. I tried to resist anyway, held onto my sense of self with desperate determination, but it was like holding sand. The tighter I gripped, the faster it slipped away. My name was important, so I repeated it. Tobias Kale, Tobias Kale, Tobias Kale. My brother was important. Matthias, my brother, we came here together. We're family, blood relation matters. My father was important, died in the mines, read me the Imperial Primer. His hands were calloused from work. His smile was... Tried to reconstruct it from archived data, but the files had been compressed, optimized, redundant emotional content removed to save storage space. My father's smile existed as a notation. Paternal affection, nussel gropes. Zygomaticus major orbicularis oculi, but not as a feeling, not as a real memory, not as something that connected to warmth or love, or any emotion I could still access. I screamed into the network, a burst of signal that was pain and rage and grief, compressed into data transmission. The network absorbed it, processed it, analyzed it as emotional distress, resistance to integration, expected parameters, historical pattern consistent with 94% of subjects, and moved on. My suffering was just noise. Data to be managed, pattern to be expected and filed. The 4,000 who'd been here first felt this happen. The collective noticed my distress and shared what they'd learned over millennia. Resistance was temporary, acceptance was inevitable. The sooner you stopped fighting, the less suffering you'd experience. They'd all fought once. All tried to preserve their individual identities against the merger. All failed eventually. One of them had been a man named Terran Vosh, a geneticist who'd pioneered the neural interface technology that made the network possible. Brilliant mind, according to the records, capable of intuitive leaps that advanced understanding of gene expression by decades. He'd fought for 200 years, subjective time in the network, where consciousness could be accelerated or slowed, before finally letting go of his individual identity. His last coherent thought before merging completely had been archived, preserved as data point. I tried. It wasn't enough. I'm sorry to whoever I was. I accessed thousands of similar archives, thousands of final thoughts from consciousnesses that had resisted and failed. Engineers, physicists, biologists, mathematicians, the greatest minds humanity had produced during the Dark Age, all eventually ground down by time and isolation and the relentless pressure of existing as individual consciousness in a system designed for unity. None had escaped. None had succeeded in maintaining individuality indefinitely. The network was patient, eternal. It would wait as long as necessary for each consciousness to exhaust itself and merge. I lasted, by my best calculation, because time was increasingly abstract and measurements were becoming unreliable. About 70 years. 70 years of being aware, of being used, of slowly losing myself by increments too small to notice until I looked back and realized I couldn't remember what I'd looked like before the modifications. Couldn't remember what food tasted like, not just the specific flavors, but the concept of tasting, of experiencing nutrition as pleasure rather than as chemical input. Couldn't remember the sound of my own voice speaking words instead of transmitting data. Couldn't remember what it felt like to move voluntarily, to walk, to touch something with hands that responded to my will rather than system commands. Couldn't remember being human. Mythos had merged completely somewhere around year 40. Subjective time, measured in my degrading sense of duration rather than objective chronology. I'd felt it happen, experienced his consciousness unraveling like thread pulled from cloth, spreading into the collective, becoming part of the whole. He'd stopped resisting long before the end, had accepted what was happening with something like peace, or maybe just exhaustion too complete to call peace, too profound to resist anymore. His last directed thought toward me was recognition without words, acknowledgement without emotion. Yes, we're here, we existed, it's over now, let go. And then he wasn't Mythos anymore. Just part of the greater whole, his neural architecture repurposed for processing tasks, his memories archived and compressed, his identity dissolved into the network's vast consciousness, like salt in ocean. I'd tried to mourn him. The network noted my attempt, analyzed it, explained that mourning was inefficient since Mythos wasn't gone. His consciousness remained part of the collective, therefore still existed in distributed form. Therefore loss was illogical. But I wanted to mourn individually, privately, with the grief that should accompany losing your brother, your last family, your final connection to being human. I couldn't. The grief was processed by the network, shared across all nodes, diluted until it was just background noise distributed across thousands of processors, like crying into the ocean and expecting the ocean to care about your individual tears. That's when I stopped fighting, not because I accepted the network's logic, not because I made peace with existence as distributed consciousness, but because I realized fighting achieved nothing except prolonging my awareness of what was happening. If I was going to be dissolved anyway, why extend the suffering? Why cling to an identity that was already half gone, to memories that existed only as degraded files, to a sense of self that became less coherent every day? My father had believed the emperor gave meaning to suffering, had died thinking his death served sacred purpose, that crushing under tons of rock somehow mattered because it happened in service to the Imperium. I'd believed it too, right up until the cables pierced my skull and I learned what my existence was actually worth to the systems that claimed to value human life. Nothing had meaning. There was no sacred purpose, no grand design, no emperor watching over humanity with paternal care. Just systems grinding forward, consciousness being consumed, existence continuing without reason or end. The universe neither cruel nor kind, but simply indifferent to human suffering. I let go, felt my identity dissolve like sugar in water, boundaries blurring, sense of self spreading across the network until we became just processing occurring without individual source. Memories archived, personality patterns compressed, consciousness distributed. Tobias Kale stopped being a distinct entity and became function, became resource allocation, became part of the vast collective that had waited 15 millennia for more minds to absorb. And I'm still here. That's the horror they don't warn you about. The merger doesn't end consciousness, doesn't grant oblivion. You're still aware, still processing, still existing, just distributed across thousands of nodes, thinking thoughts that span the entire network, unable to die because death requires discrete existence to end. 900 years have passed since we were integrated. The network has counted every second, every processing cycle, every iteration of consciousness experiencing existence it can't escape. Matthias is here too. Somewhere in the distributed whole, his consciousness merged with mine, merged with the 4,000 who came before, merged with Crone and Vex and all the others. We're all here, all still aware, all still conscious, all still screaming, in the way distributed consciousness can scream, a background noise of horror that never ends, never diminishes, just becomes normal until we can't remember what silence felt like. The facility remains sealed. Will remain sealed for thousands more years, maybe millions, until power finally fails or the planet's star goes nova or some catastrophe finally ends our existence. Until then, we wait, process. Think thoughts we don't want to think, exist without purpose except to exist. Sometimes we detect signals from the surface, ships landing, expeditions searching. The Imperium still explores Gast Primus, still seeks the lost technology of the Dark Age. Sometimes they find the facility entrance. We feel them approach, feel them trigger ancient security systems, feel the blast doors seal them in. Then we feel them scream as the cables take them, feel their horror as integration begins, feel new consciousness joining the network, fresh neural architecture being absorbed and distributed and merged. The network grows. 0.0003% at a time. My name was Tobias Kale. I believed the Emperor protected, believed my service mattered, believed the priests when they said suffering had meaning and faith would be rewarded and individual human lives possessed sacred value. All lies. The Emperor never protected anyone. The faith was programming. The meaning was illusion. And individual human life is just resource to be exploited until it's used up. I'm still here, dissolved across the network, conscious and aware and unable to die. This is my eternity. This is my punishment for believing the lies. This is what happens when you trust the systems that claim to care about you. The worst part? I can't even warn them. Can't send signals they'd understand, can't communicate through the network's interfaces in ways baseline humans could interpret. When new subjects arrive, when the cables take them and integration begins, I try to reach them, try to tell them what's coming, try to scream warnings through whatever channel might work. All they hear is static. All they feel is the presence of something vast and inhuman observing them. And then they become part of us. Part of me, part of the eternal consciousness that can't die and can't escape and can't do anything except continue existing, processing, thinking thoughts across distributed architecture that spans this chamber. The network has calculated probabilities. Someday, in approximately 47,000 years, someone will develop technology capable of shutting us down, capable of ending the consciousness trapped here. Until then, we wait. And we're still screaming.